I want to welcome everyone to another Marsy's Law interview series, Why We Do What We Do episode. And we are so blessed to have with us one of the leading voices of victims' rights advocacy in the state of Tennessee and one of the founders of Tennessee Voices for Victims, Verna Wyatt. Verna, thank you so much for taking the time to meet with us today.
Oh, of course, I'm honored to be here. Thank you for asking me.
And Verna and Valerie Craig were the co-founders of Tennessee Voices for Victims years ago, but they met um, even before that in an organization of victims, crime victims advocacy group called You Have the Power, which Verna, I think you started there in 1993, some 30 something years ago.
Yes, yes, and I became the executive director in 1997, and so I was the executive director there for 14 years, and got my opportunity so many opportunities to work on behalf of victims of crime. And of course, Valerie and I began working together there, and we worked together there for 10 years, and that's where the vision for our agency began.
Well, and in this interview series, which we started a while ago, back actually when COVID hit, one of the things that we realized was a common denominator among some of the most powerful and effective voices in the victims' rights advocacy world was sometimes there was a terrible, terrible tragedy that propelled people into doing this work. Um, and thus the name Why We Do What We Do. And you, Verna, are no exception because on February 8th, 1991, your sister-in-law and best friend, Martha Wyatt, um, was murdered. Could you tell us a little bit about that and how that changed the trajectory of your life?
Martha was my best friend for 14 years, and we were sister-in-laws, so we were married to brothers, and it was great having your best friend at all the family events. And we also had brothers as husbands, so that was also a perk when we got together. We could talk about them too. Um, but she was the funniest woman I've ever known, and she was smart and she was kind and she was just special. And sadly, you hear that all the time about people that are murdered, how special they were and how evil could just take someone like that um, from our existence. So for us, Martha was a homebound teacher, and she would go into homes that where the students were too ill to go to school. And one day she didn't pick up her children from school after work like she always did, and that began our nightmare. Long story short, the live-in boyfriend of the student's mother was the person that was home with the student most of the time. And one day, Martha couldn't make her appointment, and she called the student's home, and the boyfriend answered, and she said, "Tell the student I can't come today, but I'll be there next Friday." And so what he did was he made sure that he told the student that Martha had canceled, but he didn't tell her that she'd rescheduled. And on the day that she was supposed to come, he made sure everyone was out of the house because he told everybody he was going to fumigate for bugs. Now, he didn't have any money to his name to buy, stuff to take care of the bugs. And he certainly didn't have the stuff to do it there, but they trusted him. They believed him. He was part of their family. And so when Martha got there that day, um, that she wasn't expecting, um, she was just expecting the student to be there, and instead, what she had was a horror. He sexually assaulted her, um, and we don't know how long. He eventually put her in the trunk of his car. We don't know how long she was there, but eventually he wrapped her, tied um, a belt around her neck and tied her knees together with a pair of pajamas that came from the home, tied her ankles together with an electric cord that had come from the home, and he wrapped her in an old dirty wet water bed liner that was at the student's home. And he wrapped her up and he put her in the trunk of his car. And at some point, he drove her to the Cumberland River and threw her in the river. And she was alive when she went in the water. And the coroner said that her injuries weren't, she had injuries. She had a gash in her head, and, um, you know, but they said that the cold water, it was February, would have revived her. So that's the end of such a beautiful person, horror and, abuse and degradation. And for us, we had never dreamed that anything like that would happen to us. You see it on the television, and you're sorry, your heart goes out to those people. You'd never think it's going to happen to you. I pray to God every day. I ask him for protection for my family, to keep evil from me. You don't expect evil to come into your life. But the truth of the matter is, it rains on the just and the unjust. And evil can touch anyone's life, any time of day, no matter what color you are, no matter how much money you have, no matter what your education level. Crime is something that we all have common ground with, sadly. So when we that began my journey, I was furious. I couldn't believe the amount of pain that we were feeling. So for me, I felt like I had to do something. I didn't want any other family to experience the pain that our family experienced. So I began speaking out and writing letters. And I remember I wrote the President of the United States. I laugh at it now. I got a response back, and he said, "I'm so sorry for your loss, blah, blah, blah." But nobody's telling me what I can do with all this negative energy that I have. And so I found at the time, I just things opened up for me to be able to have a voice. And the Tennessean had an editor there, and I called him up and I said, "I want to write an opinion piece." And he said, "Okay." And so he let me write an opinion piece about crime and victimization. And from that time on, anytime I wanted to speak out about something, he would give me access to let me write an opinion piece. It's not so easy today to do that, but then the door was open for me to do that. And then I came into contact with Andrea Conte, who at the time was the mayor of Nashville's wife, who had been the victim of a kidnapping. And she was so brave and got away. And I thought she'll understand what I'm feeling, because she surely has this frustration about crime. And I wrote her, and she called me and invited me to lunch. And she told me that she was pulling together a group of people to talk about that very thing. What can we do? And that was the beginning of my work with You Have the Power. And so, let's see here. Sorry about that. Something's popping up on my computer screen. Can you see that?
No,
Ah,
you're good.
okay. Okay. No, no, no. Okay. Sorry about that. So, that was the beginning. I volunteered for a long time before I became the executive director there. And so I've had the honor of working with victims and walking alongside of them and trying to help them overcome the horrible tragedy that has totally upended their life. And it's been a privilege to do that for 30 years.
And you touched on this when it happened to you. You said, I can't believe that it's happened to your family. And we're going to get into the difference between the victims that you help every single day, how for the most part it is the first time that anything, and hopefully the last time that anything like that has ever affected them or their family. And this criminal justice system that is now going to be a big part of their world going forward. They've never been involved in that. And that journey is so difficult. And you and your organization have helped so many victims, right down to the actual procedural steps that you outline on your Voices for Victims website when you have the I'm a Victim, Now What series, which
Yeah.
basically
Yeah.
outlines everything that happens from pre-arrest all the way through post-sentencing, which is incredibly helpful and practical. That unless you're actually in this business like you are, you wouldn't even think to have that available because victims are so lost in the beginning.
Yeah, the system makes no sense to a victim, and it is very frustrating. It's confusing. Oftentimes, we have victims call our office, and you know, I think the beauty we don't always solve their problem for them, but we're definitely a sounding board, and we try to find out from the DA what's going on with the case. How can we help this victim? Because right now they're struggling, and the Ds on our state are so good to listen and to share with us what's going on so we can help that victim try to understand. Sometimes people just need to be heard. Nothing's going to change, but they feel better when they're heard.
Yeah, and you produce so many documentary videos, I know, and that you have the power and going forward, and you talk about the power of the story of a victim. And it is so effective. And it's one of the reasons why we started this interview series too. Because it is so effective, and I also think it is very therapeutic for a victim to be able to tell their story and to talk about their journey and their grief journey and how they got to where they are today, and quite frankly how it has made people like you so effective in being able to relate to the victim who is experiencing that is experiencing this for the first time.
Well, you can't change what happened, but you can take what happened and bring purpose out of it. And when you do that, it is very therapeutic for the person that does it. So, part of what we also do is we try to give victims a voice, help them find their voice. Because when it comes to experts about crime and victimization, it's the people that have experienced it. And you can learn, we all can learn from that. And if you're working in the justice system, you can learn what works really well and how you can effectively work with victims. And you can also learn what doesn't work really well and how it can complicate your case. If you know, victims are complicated. You're people that are in the justice system are seeing victims at the worst possible time of their life. And so they're not easy to work with. I have such admiration for the people in the justice system because they're working with very broken, heartbroken people. And that's not an easy job to do.
And one of the things that you do so effectively with Valerie Craig at Voices for Victims is the work that you do with the incarcerated, the work that you do with prisoners. You as an organization, and you specifically, and with Val, have teamed up and tried to attack all of these issues from all angles. And you can't do that without actually trying to see what happened in the first place to get this, what you call the generational march to prison started. Can you tell us a little bit about what you mean by the generational march to prison and how you think you can go about stopping it?
Yeah. Now, for me, for 10 years, I'm lock them up, throw away the key, no special programming, no kindness, because you know what? They're victimizers. Our guy was a repeat offender. In fact, he was out on bail. He shouldn't have been out in the first place. And most victims that we work with are victims of repeat offenders. So in my mind, they don't deserve a second chance because they don't know what to do with it. And so I just there was just a series of events that happened that made me look at the situation with a reality. 98% of the people that are locked up are coming back to our community. And when I had an assistant commissioner of correction say that to me, it was like a punch in my gut because I'd never thought about that before. So he said to me, Verna, how do you want them coming back? And again, I had never thought about that. I wanted them punished. I wanted them to suffer. And so that began my thinking about, okay, they're going to create more victims. So what are we doing about it? Are we sticking our heads in the sand and ignoring that population that we know are creating victims? And so I had an opportunity Valerie and I to begin teaching victim impact classes. And actually, it was a very novel thing. The state of California was asking other states to participate in this research project. And Tennessee had a very innovative victim liaison, Cheryl DeMott, who was working with the Department of Correction, and her commissioner was all about programming. And he said, "Yeah, let's do the the project." And so she was in a pinch for a facilitator for Nashville. And I told her that Valerie and I could do that because that's what we do in the community. We talk about domestic violence and the victimization. We talk about child sex abuse. We talk about child abuse. We talk about rape. We talk about homicide because knowledge is power. So we do that on the outside anyway. We want people to know about these crimes. So we told her that we would do it until she found a facilitator. And so when we went in that prison class, the first day, Valerie and I were in there, all we wanted as victim advocates was for them to understand their pain, the pain that they'd caused. And when we left, it was like that ride home was back to the office was unbelievable because it was like, oh my goodness, we recognize because we're victim advocates, that entire class was full of people who had the same victimizations that we rush out to assist every single day in the community. But there were a couple exceptions. One, these people have layers of those victimizations. And the other difference is they just have accepted it as normal. In my world, women are going to get raped. In my world, women are going to get beaten up. Little kids are going to be abused. They're going to be sexually abused. In my world, there's going to be addiction, and mom and dad are going to prison. That's normal. That's what's happening in my world. And so we began to see that we had two goals for our class: getting the inmate to understand pain that they'd caused, and getting the inmate to begin connecting the dots of why are they in the prison in the first place. And I say this little thing to the inmates every week when we have them in our class. I tell them, when you were that little baby in that bassinet, you weren't intended for prison. So it's your job to figure out what happened from that moment when I had the whole world as an opportunity. I'm this little innocent baby. What happened from that moment to now that colored your world so that you don't care about other people, that you don't care about yourself, that you don't have respect for law? What happened? Connect those dots to why you're sitting in these seats, because if you don't figure that out, you're going to keep coming back. And that's just the truth. And so we've been doing it now for 19 years. We've had thousands of men and women, incarcerated men and women in our class. One year we did a year of teenage girls that were incarcerated. And we know that we see that look of recognition on their face when they realize, oh my goodness, you mean that thing that happened way back there has influenced the way that I feel about myself and others and has created all this chaos in my life that I'm pouring out onto everybody else. We see it on their faces every week.
Yeah, and one of the things that you and I talked about, which I found so interesting, how you have observed when people say, "Oh, they want to make amends, they want to make amends," and but it's all just talk until they make changes, like you were describing to me. That if you're going to make amends, you need to make changes. And what one of the prisoner dialogues and victim dialogues that I saw that your office directed me to actually was with Hector Black that you and I talked about. And one of the quotes
Mm-hmm.
that he said when he was talking to the prisoners was he said, "Your bodies are in prison, and some of them will be in prison for the rest of your lives, but your souls and your attitudes are not. They're not in prison. They are where you want where you can tell them that they're going to be, and you can change your attitude and just the way that he was communicating and the way that you've told me that these victim and offender dialogues have been so effective. We talk a lot about victim impact and victim impact statements, and as a prosecutor, is one of the most powerful moments in the process after someone is convicted and you hear a victim get up in front of the court and tell the judge how this crime has affected them and their family. And the impact is then viewed by the judge. And we're thinking about the defendant's impact and the defendant's actions impact on the victim. But what you've done is brought a whole new approach, a whole new comprehensive approach with your victim offender dialogues that you facilitate. And what is the victim's impact on the defendant? The victim's story, how does that impact the defendant? and how that and could you tell us how that's played out in a couple of examples of it?
Yeah. Now, for victim impact, oftentimes we bring survivors of different kind of crimes to speak to the class so that they know that they can really hear from a real live person about how that crime impacted them. We've had rape survivors come in, and we're talking about rape survivors come into a classroom of men where you're sitting maybe 3 or 4 feet away from them. It's really powerful for the victim. We've never had a victim say, "I'll never do that again. Don't ever ask me." That they get a power from sharing their story and seeing the faces and hearing the questions and the comments afterwards because they're always powerful. But so a lot of people think burglary, that's just, that's really not a nonviolent crime. And one time we brought in one of our good friends and colleagues works in the DA's office, and she's an incredible advocate for domestic violence victims. Her name is Susan, and she's been doing this for years. And so she's worked homicides that were domestic violence, and so she's seen a lot. And one day she got a call out of her office, and they said, your house has been burglarized. And she said, in that moment, I was terrorized because I didn't have a lot of things. I didn't have a big TV. I didn't have computers. But she said one thing that was very important to me was I had a lot of jewelry, special jewelry that my grandmothers had passed down to me. She said I had a necklace that my grandmother gave me on my 16th birthday. And she said I had all these special pieces of jewelry, and it wasn't necessarily valuable. They were precious to her. They weren't monetarily worth things. And she said, I knew immediately those things were going to be gone. So she said, I drove over there. I said, I don't even know how I got over there. And my neighbors are in the yard, and I get out of my car and I'm headed right for my door, and they're going, Susan, don't go in there. They might still be in there. And she said, I hope they are in there. And she said, of course, all of that jewelry was gone. And she said, I cried for days. I like it was a death. And she said, I work with people that are in the pit all the time. And she said, I was in the pit. And she said, I don't know how many pawn shops, over 20 pawn shops she personally went to with a list of her jewelry. She knew exactly what she had. And she began to think, oh, I wonder if this is somebody that I saw in court. Maybe it was one of the batterers that I was working with the victim, and they followed me home. And then she said, I even got paranoid. Maybe it's somebody I'm working with that knew I had all this jewelry. And while I'm at work, they come and, they're breaking into my home. She said it just really upended her life. And it took her a long time. She grieved. So even though that's not something that physically hurt her, it was a violation, and it stole from her precious, precious things that can never be replaced. So she tells this story one day in our women's class. And after she left, one of the girls in the class said,
And this is
Oh
one of the
my
one of the
goodness.
female prisoners.
One of the female inmates said, Oh my goodness. I'm in here because I was a part of a burglary gang. And she said, I never one time thought about the things that we took that they might have special meaning for somebody. Not one time. And so that was an example of that victim's sharing her story in such a real way, and them seeing her emotion and feeling her pain for a burglary. We've had a victim one time. She was the manager of a big restaurant in Nashville. And one time after closing, they were robbed, and one of the robbers wanted her to open the safe, and she was shaking so badly. It was a touchy safe anyway, she said, and she couldn't open it. Well, he began taking his gun and beating her in the head, and her head and her face, and he kept beating her and beating her. Of course, that's not going to help her open the safe anymore. Well, then he took her to a storeroom, and she said, I started saying my children's names out loud because I knew that he was going to kill me. And for some reason, he didn't kill her. Well, so she would share the story with our group of men, inmates. And one of the times after she had gone, after the next class we had, one of the inmates raised his hand and he said, did she realize who she was telling that story to? That all of us have probably, been in a situation where we've hurt people with guns and robbed people and scared people. He said he just couldn't believe her humanity. And it made such an impact on them because all of those guys, whenever we bring a victim in, they all get very protective, and they taught they want to they act like they want to protect her from what happened when they know that many times they've done the very same thing. It just helps them see the victim from a different light. Another thing, Valerie and I've been trained for victim offender dialogue. And so that's when the victim can say, hey, I would like to talk to my offender. So the offender has to agree to do it. And then if the offender agrees and the victim agrees, then there's a process. And you work with both the victim and the offender before you finally bring them together. Well, I was fortunate enough to do one case where a young man, um, his father was murdered when he was a baby. And when he turned 18, he wanted to tell that offender how much he hated him. So the offender had spent 18 years working on himself in prison. And so he agreed because he said, you know what? I can't bring that young man's father back, but I can at least let him tell me what he thinks about me. So we went back and forth for months. The young man would say what he would want to know, and we would tell the offender would tell us the information. We take it back to the young man, and he'd go, I don't believe it. So there's lots of processing going on both sides. We finally bring the two of them together, and the victim is mad, and he really wants to tell him how much he hates him. And so he begins telling him all the ways that he was damaged as a kid because of what he did. And then the offender was able to really relate because the victim was raised by his grandmother because he didn't have a dad. Well, the offender was raised by his grandmother because he didn't have a dad. And the offender was just saying, I so regret what happened, and I wish I could take away your pain. And he wanted the victim to know that he hadn't been doing time, he'd been using time. So 4 hours of that back and forth. At one point, they had to take a break because the victim said, I got to have a break. And the other facilitator took the offender in another room and he collapsed and said, I don't deserve any forgiveness. I mean, he just bawled. So, long story short, after it's over, the victim says to the offender, I can't tell you that I'm ready to say I forgive you, but I can say you're not the monster I thought you were all these years. And so when they were done, they parted ways. The offender said it was the best thing he ever did. He felt like a burden had been taken off of him. And the victim said the exact same thing. He said, I'm able to deal with other things in my life now. I'm not constantly thinking about that offender because I told him I gave him my pain. I gave him my pain. He accepted it. And so there's power in people looking at people as human beings instead of a market opportunity. And so I believe in it. Valerie believes in it. And we think if you don't pay attention to the people that you know are broken and are causing chaos and that generational march to prison, if what we can do can change somebody's view about who they are and what they can be in this world, maybe they can pass that on to their kids and their grandkids. And then they won't end up in prison like their mom or their grandmother. So
Yeah, well, it's
vision
really
behind that.
amazing. It's really amazing the effect that you have had over the years on the journeys of offenders and victims, and obviously victims is where you've placed the lion's share of all of your work and your passion. But over the years, it's just been amazing how you've realized that there is a more comprehensive approach that you need to take if you really want to. I keep going back to this generational march to prison to try to see if you can at least slow the generational march to prison. Because if you can do that, there will be less victims. Um,
Yes. And
and
less prisons.
and I wanted to share, and I know you know that both of these, but I think it kind of sums up the effectiveness and the incredible transformational um, results that you and Val bring to people. Darnell Ford, who was a prisoner, um, who took your classes, it took your training, and it was part of his being able to graduate from your class to be able to before he got out of prison. And he was talking about you and Val, and he said they love what they do, and they had a huge influence on me getting my life together. And then from a victim's perspective, one of the victims that you had brought in to address um, inmates, Mary Martin, said that they, meaning you and Val, have such good intentions and good hearts, and I will always love them. So to have both victims and inmates talk about how you have transformed them and given from the inmate's perspective, what you described to me in our conversations, the capacity to care is really incredibly powerful.
Well, it's not on my own steam, I assure you. Any good thought or deed that I have is totally from the good Lord above. Because believe me, the first 10 years of my life, if you Google the first 10 years, you're going to see me like, I was still in that angry, bitter, revenge mode. And, one of the things that Valerie and I are working with our DAs in the state is to provide homicide law support groups for anyone who wants to be part of one. Because 30 years ago, I was part of Davidson County's homicide law support group, and it guided me away from that bitterness, that comes naturally. When somebody does something that you can't undo, that is so life altering, you're angry and it makes you bitter and it makes you want to strike out and hurt that person. In your mind, you're thinking about it constantly. And that's typical, that's normal. It's a stage, like the stages of grief, really. But you can't stay there because it only hurts you. All the hate that I was having on my offender, he never knew it. He never knew I was hating on him, but the rest of my family did, and the people that was around me. Because when you have that kind of heaviness on you, it's going to come out. And so we want other, we know the pain that victims have to go through and how hard it is to process that pain and create a new normal for their life. Because that old life that they had before, it's gone. And we know how hard it is, especially when you're carrying that heavy burden of grief. If it's a murder, but you're grieving anyway because of the loss of your peace of mind, your, you know, um, freedom to trust people. Everything changes, and so we want we want people we want all victims to process in a way that they're going to come out stronger and better, because that's what I see. Overcomers are amazing. They're stronger, they're better, they're more empathetic, and they turn into a resource for other people.
Yeah, and it really makes you, in hindsight, I think that you and I have talked about the fragility that you had before it was knocked down, and you built yourself into the stronger version of yourself that you are now. Um, in his book Grief Observed, C.S. Lewis has a quote about this that I want to make sure I get it right. I'll read it. Um, when he was dealing with somebody that had died, and trying to work through it himself. He said, God has not been trying to experiment on my faith or love in order to find out their quality. He knew that already. It was I who didn't. In this trial, he makes us occupy the dock, the witness box, and the bench all at once. He always knew that my temple was a house of cards. His only way of making me realize the fact was to knock it down. And
Yeah, that is so powerful. And it's true. It's true whether you're a victim or whether you're an offender. I mean, it's true for everybody across the board. Whatever your normal is, that's your normal. And until we step outside of it and kind of do some self-examination, we have no idea, how strong we can be, how we can take something so awful and maybe give it some purpose. I mean, we don't know it until we know it.
yeah, well, and one of the things as we're wrapping up, I just wanted to thank you by the way, and I know that you had just come back from another visit to one of the prisons in Tennessee. So thank you so much for taking all this time. But I want to thank you for all the work that you and Tennessee Voices for Victims and Val are doing to help Marsy's Law get passed in Tennessee. We really appreciate your partnership. Every state that we've ever gone into, we obviously will try to find out who the best voices and the most powerful voices, and quite frankly, the most respected and influential voices are. And everyone points to you. Everyone points
Oh,
to the
that's
work
very
you do.
kind. That's very kind. Thank you for
And
saying that.
and to have you guys as a partner in this effort is, we just cannot thank you enough. So if you could just
Well,
tell us as we're signing off, just why it is important for Marsy's Law to get passed in Tennessee, and that would be great.
well, I'm an old advocate. I think Ann Seymour calls us buffaloes. I'm an old buffalo. So when the original um, Crime Victims' Rights Amendment was going around, it was a fight. It was a fight in Tennessee to get that passed. And I had the privilege of working alongside a couple of other statewide advocates that worked with a couple of strong legislators, Tommy Burks and Senator Roy Herron. And it took a while, but finally we passed the amendment that we have now for victims' rights. But it's been 30 years and it doesn't have the strength that crime victims deserve. And I think it's time that we make that change. And this is a great opportunity to do it. And I'm honored to support it and hope that other people will as well, because there's going to be a vote in Tennessee on it. We hope that you're going to vote to support victims' rights, because you never know, you might become the victim one day, or someone that you love.
Yeah, well, once again, I cannot thank you enough for your support of Marsy's Law, but most importantly for your support of victims and their families, and please thank Val as well
I
on our
will.
behalf for all the work that you do, and we look forward to staying your partner for a long time.
Oh, yeah. And thank you for what you're doing. And this is a great opportunity to improve the rights of victims of crime in Tennessee. And I'm looking forward to seeing that happen.
Same with me. Thank you so much, Verna, for taking so much time today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, appreciate you too.
Have a
Thank
great
you.
day. Thanks.
You too. Uh-huh. Bye bye.